It's been 2 years since I made a video where I tried forcing myself to daily drive Linux, and while that experiment was very fun, I ended up running into issues such as my desktop being laggy, problems with the software I need to use, reliability issues and so on, and while I was somewhat able to deal with most of them, there actually were a few other deal-breaking issues that I never mentioned. One of them was the fact that in certain programs, my microphone sounded distorted to the extent that it was borderline unusable, which turned out to be some kind of an incompatibility between the Linux kernel audio drivers and the audio chipset of my relatively popular motherboard, meaning that I basically had no choice but to use a different operating system if I wanted to properly use my microphone, and that's also where my adventures with Linux came to a halt for the time being, in the hopes that one day the situation will improve. And well, ever since then, a lot has happened, not only in the Linux space, but also in the tech and operating system world as a whole. Not just that, but in the meantime, I also did a similar experiment with macOS, as well as built a completely new desktop featuring an RTX 4090, which is also the setup I'm going to be running Linux on in this video. In fact, I already started playing around with Linux for this challenge over 8 months ago in 2023, so I have a lot to talk about. But before I get into that, I first want to talk a little bit about what happened during my macOS challenge, because it's going to be important for the rest of this video. Long story short, I upgraded from my 980 Ti desktop that I also used in the previous Linux video to an M1 Max MacBook Pro because I needed a portable laptop that can also handle heavy video editing, and at the time, the M1 Max was an obvious choice. My issue with the MacBook, however, was the fact that it was running macOS, which I was dumbfounded to discover had some serious usability issues and limited window management capabilities out of the box that made it very painful for me to use, and I recommend watching my full video on macOS to discover exactly why. But near the end of that video, I discovered that there is a third-party tiling window manager for macOS called Yabai. Now, even though I had installed a tiling window manager on Linux in the past, I never really learned to use one, nor properly understood what the tiling window manager workflow is actually like. But I was desperate enough to give it my all to see if learning one can save my experience on macOS, and in a way, it did. Not only did I now have a rather pleasant way of managing my windows, but I also started using a hotkey daemon that controlled the tiling window manager to do other tasks as well, such as switch directly to a specific keyboard layout or audio source, launch specific applications and so on, meaning that the way I use my computer had completely changed as I learned an entirely new workflow that's completely different from what I was used to before on Windows or what was intended on macOS. In fact, after I built my new desktop, it was actually kind of difficult to go back to Windows because I was so used to automatic tiling combined with virtual desktops that going back to a single space with floating windows felt really awkward to use, and while I was able to get used to Windows again over time, I realized that I preferred the new workflow that I had recently discovered and specifically optimized for myself, but the issue is that it's not really possible to properly recreate on Windows, so the only option I had was to try a tiling window manager on Linux. And I was actually very excited for this because while I very much appreciate Yabai, at the end of the day, it's still third-party software built upon the closed nature of macOS, so the experience isn't entirely perfect. It's not rare to come across bugs, and it occasionally can feel a bit sluggish, none of which should be the case on Linux, where there are plenty of native tiling window managers to choose from, and customizing them to my needs should be more than possible, or at least that's what I imagined, so let's get into it. So after I built my new PC, the first thing I did was actually install Windows 11 on it because I wanted to focus on editing one of my most important videos, for which I needed to make sure that my computer was going to be as stable and reliable as possible, and I wasn't sure that that was going to be the case on Linux yet. But after I was done with that, I was ready to go all out on trying Linux, so I prepared a brand new 4TB NVMe SSD, onto which I wanted to install Ubuntu to see how it compares to the last time I tried it. Ironically though, I literally couldn't even install it because apparently, despite the fact that the 4090 was already a year old at the time, it was still too new for the latest version of Ubuntu that released just a month before I tried installing it here, Though after battling with it for a while, I was able to boot via safe mode, with the only difference being that after 5 minutes it would actually boot instead of crash. But anyway, that issue disappeared once I finally installed the Nvidia drivers. And even though Ubuntu is kind of controversial, I still think it's one of the best looking and most polished distros straight out of the box. I also really like the new wallpaper, especially in dark modes, and I can imagine that if I wasn't so interested in a very particular workflow, I'd possibly just keep my PC like this in the vanilla state without doing any further customizations, other than perhaps installing dash to panel like last time, because I don't want any bars on top of the screen for multiple reasons. Too bad that just like last time, some elements of the desktop environment were lagging despite having basically the best hardware money can buy, and everything was full of graphical glitches and flickering, so I tried upgrading from the Nvidia 535 driver to the brand new 545 one in the hopes that it will fix said glitches, and while it did help a little bit, it didn't really fix it, and it actually introduced a few different issues as well, such as my browser occasionally freezing when I started scrolling. Those issues happened on X11 though, so I tried Wayland, which by now was available by default without the user needing to configure it by themselves, and once I logged into it, everything was incredibly smooth. But I quickly discovered that Wayland had its own set of issues as well, such as picture-heavy websites freezing, and applications such as Discord, Spotify, and VS Code had this weird stuttering issue, especially when typing, where inputs were occasionally being ignored and text kept appearing and disappearing and so on. So basically, my first Linux experience with this setup was that it was basically unusable because both X11 as well as Wayland had some pretty bad issues, at least on Ubuntu and its default GNOME-based desktop environment. So for the time being, I decided that I'd be better off reverting the Nvidia 545 driver back to 535, which I tried doing through the Ubuntu driver manager, and not only did it leave me with broken graphics drivers like that one scenario I had in my previous video, but it also literally uninstalled my network driver as well, meaning that I was completely unable to use the internet on my computer, and as insane as it might sound, it seems to be a very common issue on Ubuntu, so I decided that I'll just wipe everything and install the distro known as Nobara 38 instead. Nobara is essentially a slightly modified version of another distro known as Fedora, which itself is a distro that has more up-to-date packages compared to other distros while still staying relatively polished, and Nobara basically adds on top of that by making it much easier to install Nvidia drivers and has various fixes for other programs such as DaVinci Resolve, like, you know, being able to actually install it without having to spend an hour on copying system files around. So I decided to try it out, and sure enough, Nvidia drivers were indeed effortless to install, and DaVinci Resolve launched without issues. Unfortunately though, the same issues I had on Ubuntu with Wayland and X11 were still happening on GNOME, even on Nobara 38, so I suppose there was no escape from that other than just not using GNOME, which I wasn't too sad over, since I was regardless mostly interested in using a tiling window manager, which I'll get into later, because before that, I want to talk about one of the most well-known issues on Linux, aka fractional scaling. In my previous Linux video, I was using a 27-inch 1440p monitor, and one of the complaints I had was that fonts on Linux looked blurry, but what I discovered was that the situation was just as bad, if not even worse, on macOS, and I recommend watching my video on it for more details, but long story short, the only workaround was to get a higher DPI display, so I eventually upgraded to a 27-inch 4K 160Hz monitor instead, which quote-unquote solved the font issue on macOS, and the fonts on Linux now look completely fine as well. But what I discovered was that now I have to deal with a different issue on Linux, which is that I only have a choice between my UI being either too small or way too big. That's because by default, I was only able to choose between either 100 or 200% scaling, but ideally I'd like something in between, such as 125 or 150%, aka fractional scaling. Nowadays, Windows does this pretty much perfectly, aside from certain legacy installers that will end up with blurry fonts, and macOS does it by scaling everything up before scaling everything back down, which has a few downsides, so there's even a warning that there might be potential performance implications, and if you get unreasonably close to the monitor, you can see some artifacts from the scaling, but overall, it's still completely acceptable. When it comes to fractional scaling on Linux though, it's not really that well supported on X11 because there are fundamental limitations applications that make proper fractional scaling difficult, and on Wayland, while there is support for it, not every application supports Wayland yet, and those applications are going to become blurry when fractionally scaled, which is something I experienced myself, and it was a complete deal breaker. I did, however, find a sort of a workaround, which was to use GNOME tweaks to set the font scaling factor to 1.25, which worked surprisingly well, though the downside is that it applies to every monitor, so on my smaller secondary display, everything looked absolutely huge. So essentially, while solutions do exist, none of them are without potential major issues. But anyway, I wanted to see if my microphone works on this new setup, and I was appalled to discover that it had the exact same distortion problem that my previous desktop had as well, but this time, after some research, I was actually able to fix it by upgrading the also package from 1.2.8 to 1.2.10, which was a version that had been released only a few months prior. So basically, I came back to Linux just as the fix for the audio chipset came out, but it was still a bit too new to be included by default on Nobara 38, hence also on Fedora 38. However, Fedora 39 had pretty much just released as well, and it included the correct ALSA driver straight out of the box, and I figured that perhaps installing Fedora 39 might also be my best bet when it came to fixing some of the other issues I was having. So I did that, but the issues on GNOME still persisted, so out of curiosity, I tried installing KDE as well, which actually worked decently, though not perfectly, on both X11 as well as Wayland, but I've personally never really been a big fan of KDE for various reasons, so instead, it was finally time to try the tiling window manager known as i3. i3 is probably the most popular tiling window manager on Linux, and what sets it apart from the others, other than people confusing it for a processor, is that it's rather easy to get started with and to configure, especially thanks to the beginner-friendly guide on its website, which even tells you how to give presentations using i3. After you've installed and logged into i3, you're basically greeted with a blank screen with this bar on the bottom, and at this point, unless you have an i3 manual at hand, you pretty much won't know how to do anything, because unlike regular desktop environments, most tiling window managers out of the box don't come with a way to launch applications or to configure system settings with a mouse. Everything is launched with the keyboard and configured through text files. So, for example, the first thing I wanted to do was to configure i3, for which I needed to hit Mod plus Enter to open the terminal, and then I needed to open the i3 configuration file with either a terminal text editor or a graphical one, such as VS Code. I changed almost all the key bindings i3 uses to what I was already used to on my custom yabai setup, as most tiling window managers default to the so-called Vim keys, where the arrow, or rather directional keys, are replaced with HJKL, but that means that if you want to do almost anything with the tiling window manager at all, you need both hands on the keyboard at all times, and personally, I constantly use my mouse when using applications such as DaVinci Resolve and browsers, so rather than HJKL, I'd much rather just use WASD, which allows me to do almost everything with just my left hand in a very intuitive manner, whilst also being able to use my mouse at the same time. But keyboard configuration aside, what if you want to do something such as make it so that your monitors aren't stuck in 60Hz? Well, to configure anything at all about your monitors, whether it be their position, resolution, or refresh rate, you have to do it all through the command line and put those commands into a startup script. But what about disabling mouse acceleration and changing mouse sensitivity? Well, you have to create an Xorg input configuration script for that, and when it comes to changing sound volume or output devices, you have to figure out what kind of a sound server your Linux install is using, and then create a few key bindings for custom terminal commands that control it. However, what if you want to switch to a different keyboard layout, especially if you also want to type Japanese? Well, you first have to decide whether or not you want to use HiBus or FCITX5, and for Japanese, you need to decide between ANTI or MOSC, all of which you first have to install and figure out how to properly set key bindings for, and holy shit, this took me forever. But okay, what if you want to do something basic such as setting a desktop background? Well, you can't do that out of the box, so you have to download a third-party program such as Nitrogen that allows you to configure wallpapers, and once again, like with everything else, put it into a startup script. Sadly, ShareX is Windows only, so I installed Flameshot for screenshots and CopyQ for clipboard history, but I had this issue where they kept freezing when I tried using them. But I finally found the solution on Flameshot's FAQ page saying that I need a notification manager, so I installed Dunst for notifications as well. I also installed Rofi so I could more easily launch programs, as well as make an Alt-tab like menu to show my current open applications and so on, and I even made a custom script so I could record system audio by hitting a keyboard shortcut and save it into a specific folder and copy its path to the clipboard. At the current stage though, the setup wasn't very aesthetically pleasing, as it was essentially just a jumbled mess of different ancient programs in their default state, so I spent some time quote-unquote rising everything, and I also installed a compositor known as Picom, which allows i3 windows to have things such as shadows, rounded corners, transparency, and so on, and also helps to reduce screen tearing a bit. I also replaced the default i3 bar with a third-party program known as Polybar, which gave me some extra features such as a system tray, and finally, I changed the i3 configuration to customize the colors and borders of my windows, and this is what my final setup looked like. Essentially, I just have a 1 pixel white border on active applications and a dark gray one on inactive ones. I don't use rounded corners already because they're not actually supported on i3, so setting rounded corners with Picom cuts off the window borders, and I kinda like having sharp corners regardless. Perhaps it's also because by default, I don't have any gaps between windows to save screen space, but I occasionally do toggle them on and off with Ctrl-G. Now, even though this rice is extremely plain and unflavored, I tried different colors and such, but I felt like anything else just felt distracting and less readable, and regardless, I'm pretty satisfied with this minimalistic yet practical configuration. Speaking of practicality though, there were a few things that I kinda didn't like about i3, with one of them being the way resizing windows works. It just felt very weird and unintuitive, and a lot of people seemed to agree, so luckily I found a script that more or less fixed it. However, another issue is that i3 is a manual tiler, in the sense that rather than placing new windows in something like a Fibonacci type pattern, you need to use keyboard shortcuts to manually decide in which direction you want new windows to be placed in, which can occasionally be a pain. I did find a script that makes it tile automatically, but it has a limitation where it bogs out under certain conditions, after which you're kinda unable to move windows around in a specific way, so I just ended up disabling it. But there was this one issue that I just couldn't solve, which was that my favorite file manager, aka Nautilus, was stuck on the light theme, and I tried pretty much every solution I could find online and none of them worked. The weird part was that if I first put it into GNOME and then logged into i3, Nautilus would properly use the dark theme, and even apps such as GNOME Terminal were themed a bit differently. I spent multiple days and so many hours trying to find a solution to this, but in the end I just gave up because I genuinely started feeling a level of cognitive dissonance over wasting even more time than I already had on a problem like this, instead of putting that same time and energy into getting actual work done, or just doing something more fulfilling or at least enjoyable with my already limited free time. And also, how am I exactly supposed to also find time to touch some grass when there were some other problems such as these weird Nautilus context menu borders, the Nautilus quick view feature freezing with 4K videos, links not opening on Discord, my wallpaper always being broken when I restart my PC, and I still had so much configuration I needed to do, such as setting up power management scripts and menus so I could easily sleep my PC in a proper power efficient manner. But well, the justification that kept me going was that perhaps it's going to be worth it in the long term if I'm able to create a more pleasant custom workflow for myself, and at least I can make this entire experience into a video. Now, even though there still were some imperfections in my setup, I decided that it's time to stop tinkering and instead see if I can get some actual work done. When it came to coding, it's probably unsurprising to hear that the setup was incredibly pleasant to use. I often need to have at least 2 browser windows, 2 code editors, and potentially more than 5 terminals open all at the same time, between which I have to switch very frequently, and the native tiling combined with features such as the stacked layout made for a very smooth workflow even on a single monitor. It honestly wasn't all that different from my macOS setup, aside from a few features being missing, but at least it didn't have the bugs and occasional clunkiness that stems from yabai being built on top of a rather closed operating system. That being said, i3 does have some occasional screen tearing, for example when resizing and when using smooth scroll, and I've also experienced applications flashing when switching between workspaces, which can be rather unpleasant, but other than that, everything is really smooth and responsive. Or at least when using a single monitor, because at the end of the day, i3 is using X11, which is never going to be as smooth as Wayland, but Wayland-based tiling window managers don't really properly support Nvidia yet, and neither do applications such as DaVinci Resolve. Speaking of DaVinci Resolve, after applying various fixes to it on Fedora 39, I was able to get it up and running, and pretty much everything seemed to work, except for recording microphone audio in the Fairlight page, which gave me no microphone audio at all. It's weird because I remember when I made the last Linux video, I was actually able to record audio in Fairlight, but back then, other features such as speed controls were broken. If you have any experience on how to get audio recording working so I could use my microphone directly in DaVinci Resolve, please do let me know, because I had to use Audacity to record narrations, which is a huge productivity loss. Another issue is that DaVinci Resolve on Linux does not support AAC audio, so I had to use this script to convert files into supported codecs, and there were some other displeasing issues here and there as well. But other than that, making a video on Linux with i3 was actually rather pleasant. For example, one of the biggest issues I had on macOS was that when I full screen something, such as a browser window when I record B-roll with OBS, it's going to put that full screen window into its own special workspace, which is incredibly annoying as it messes up my workflow, but that doesn't happen on i3. Not only that, but it also doesn't have any of the yabai related bugs, nor the macOS oddities that I constantly had to deal with, and something I absolutely love is that I can copy an image and paste it directly into a folder on Nautilus, which not only saves me quite a lot of energy sometimes, but things like this also just make for a pleasant, friction-free workflow, and I genuinely don't understand why this is not a feature on macOS nor on Windows, where implementing such functionality with custom scripts is by no means trivial. One of the biggest downsides is perhaps that Adobe apps such as Photoshop aren't natively supported on Linux, but as a workaround, nowadays you can use Photopea, and there's even a stripped down version of Photoshop available in a browser. So even though I had to fight with restrictions imposed by such limitations and issues, I was able to make 4 videos on Linux, which is rather big if true, considering that before, such a feat seemed almost entirely unrealistic. But the reason I only made 4 videos was because one day, when I powered on my PC, I was met with a screen that said, "Fedora is updating, don't turn off your computer," and after it was done, it borked my Nvidia drivers. Now, even though I was able to reinstall them after some research, DaVinci Resolve wouldn't start anymore, and I tried 3 different drivers and even reinstalling and upgrading DaVinci Resolve itself, none of which helped. Not only was this a huge waste of time and energy, but things like this are also incredibly dangerous, because if I had been working on a project without suddenly being able to open it up or take backups anymore, I could have potentially lost a lot of work, which luckily wasn't the case, but it's still really concerning. It's probably best to exclude Nvidia drivers from being updated by the package manager, or disable automatic updates entirely to ensure better reliability. But to make matters worse, for whatever reason, my audio also completely stopped working as well, no matter what desktop environment I tried. The last thing I remember doing while it was still working was installing XFCE, which I'm not sure is related, but regardless, I decided that it's easiest just to wipe my long surviving Fedora 39 install and try a very special distro where none of this should happen, aka the official distro meant specifically for running DaVinci Resolve. Resolve. It's essentially a slightly modified version of Rocky Linux 8.6, the ISO of which you can find in the manual of DaVinci Resolve under the Linux installation instructions, and technically it's the only Linux distro Blackmagic actually supports, so in theory everything should work perfectly straight out of the box. Yet somehow the installer still managed to error, but I was able to fix it, and what I was curious about the most was whether or not I can record audio in the Fairlight page, but apparently I had no audio on my system whatsoever. The thing about Rocky Linux is that it's meant for enterprises, so it's using incredibly outdated packages and has some pretty strict restrictions to ensure reliability, but that also means that you're stuck with a very old version of GNOME, and installing things such as i3 won't be trivial, as you're not supposed to do that. I couldn't even use my external exFAT hard drive without installing some dependencies first, and I still had the GNOME graphical issues with my Nvidia card. So I pretty much knew that I most likely won't be daily driving this distro, so instead of wasting time on trying to fix all of those issues, I decided to just run a few DaVinci Resolve benchmarks that I could later compare with other distros. I used two projects. One was a simple timeline that I made for benchmarking GPU-heavy effects, and the other was my 5 years of learning Japanese video, which is a huge 45-minute project containing thousands of clips, and it uses a very wide variety of different features across DaVinci Resolve. And I'm glad to say that I was able to render both the projects with no issues, and everything on the timeline seemingly worked perfectly fine as well. I ran the same benchmarks on Windows as well, and I pretty much got the same results, but Windows was using a slower SSD, so there's a chance that it could have been slightly faster, and there are slight version, driver, and random variance differences between these comparisons as well, but the important part is that DaVinci Resolve seems to have mostly equivalent performance on either operating system. Next, I decided to install the just released Nobara 4D, and even there the installer failed, so right now there's literally not a single up-to-date distro where installing DaVinci Resolve works straight out of the box. But at least it wasn't too hard to bypass that issue there as well. I decided to do Nobara's benchmark on i3, which is an environment that should be as lightweight as it gets, but surprisingly the Rocky setup was a bit faster. So later I wanted to run the benchmark a few more times, but for whatever reason, DaVinci Resolve started getting stuck on the loading project splash screen, and I was having a few other issues with Nobara as well, so I decided to just install Fedora 4D, as regardless, I know how to set up everything by myself. Also, remember that Wayland stuttering issue I mentioned earlier in the video? Well, Nvidia just released a 555 driver that directly fixes that issue, and sure enough, after installing it on Fedora, Wayland worked pretty much perfectly, and I was even able to get DaVinci Resolve working on Wayland, which also seemed to work perfectly, and even gave some great results on benchmarks, which is very exciting, though I haven't used it extensively yet, so I'm not sure how reliable it is in reality. I also tried running the benchmark on i3 again, but this time on Fedora, and surprisingly it was the slowest thus far, so just like before, the next day I wanted to run it a few more times to see if it was just random variance, but just like on Nobara 4D, DaVinci Resolve once again suddenly started getting stuck on the loading project screen, and I really don't know how to fix it other than nuking my projects and user database, which is not really a solution as it might happen with future projects as well. And that's pretty much where I am right now. Even though I would love to daily drive Linux, limitations and reliability issues like this prevent me from doing so, and while it might be all fun and games when I'm trying things out of curiosity and working on this video at the same time, if I was forced to deal with situations like this during times where I absolutely must get work done and need reliability, it will be anything but fun. The time and energy I've already put into experimenting, researching, learning, and fixing issues is time that I could have put into something else if I had just stayed on Windows or even macOS, and in the end, I still ended up running into this particular issue that left a bleak final impression, and even if I get it fixed, I'm sure it also won't be the last time. Perhaps I can achieve reliability if I stop updating my system and software, But what new features, bug fixes, and hardware releases that I might benefit from in the future are going to be badly supported or completely unusable on Linux due to companies not prioritizing it? The dream of using Linux for everything without major sacrifices feels so close yet so far. Whether or not this journey was even worth it is an unquantifiable question that cannot be answered very easily. But the feeling I have is that while I did spend way too much time and energy on certain problems, overall, I feel like an entire new world has been unlocked for me, and despite all the struggles, it's clear that I was enjoying the process, at least to some extent, as otherwise I would have stopped the moment Ubuntu failed to install. Linux is an incredibly deep rabbit hole, but also an endless time sink for someone like me who has very specific demands, endless curiosity, and an unwillingness to give up. For example, even though I just spent a lot of time on configuring and learning i3, now I'm suddenly also interested in trying Qtile, which I could customize to behave exactly how I want in Python, as well as Hyprland, which is running Wayland and can also probably be made to look incredible, but I genuinely have to suppress my curiosity for the time being, as I already know that I'll be running into a mountain of problems, and the sacrifices I'll have to make should be left to a time where they aren't as great. Over the past few years, I've been trying out different hardware and operating systems, and I feel like I've accidentally opened up Pandora's box of endless conflict of wanting to switch between all of them. But my ever-growing dream is still the ability to use Linux without major sacrifices, and throughout all the adventures I had whilst making this part 2, I've discovered that that pipe dream has slowly started becoming a reality.